Well, I'm excited about that Monday night series. I hope each of you are going to take advantage and sign up for the Monday night series starting this very Monday night. It will be a series of opening the Bible, and you'll be able to navigate through different passages of Scripture with Pastor Jacques and on Monday nights. And the great questions of life will be answered. What's the purpose of life? Where is life headed? What happens when you die? Is it heaven, hell, or nothingness? What about the end of the world and the second coming of Christ? Will Jesus come kind of secretly in some kind of rapture? Will every eye see him when he comes? What is the destiny of our world? So we look forward to having you on these Monday nights. I'll be back with you, as Pastor said, at the end of October, and we'll have a series 3-4 nights a week as we look at the great prophecies of the book of Revelation. So it's been great to be with you this week. My wife and I have enjoyed it, and we've taught some at Newbold College up in Bracknell area, and then we've been here as well. We've traveled through Egypt and Babylon, traveled through Israel. We've looked at the footsteps of Jesus, and tonight we're going to journey to Revelation's island of Patmos. It's a fascinating journey to the island of Patmos. If you're going to go to that island, of course, you've got to go by boat. And Patmos can be reached from either Greece or Turkey. Now, if you go to Patmos by Greece, it's going to take you overnight to get there. And the sea is a little bit rough. And if you're not used to waves and your boat going up and down, you may want to try to go from Turkey rather than Greece. If you go from Turkey, you go from Kusadasi, and it's a lovely little seaport. When we go, we usually rent out an entire boat like we've done this time, and the trip will take you about 2 hours. Now, I shouldn't tell you that the sea never gets rough. One time I was coming back from filming television programs on the island of Patmos, and the wind began to blow. It began to lash the waves into fury. My film crew all went from this deck down into the bottom of the ship, and they were holding their stomach, and some may have been feeding the fish with their lunch unwillingly. And I was sitting up here because I was brought up on the sea, brought up on the Atlantic Ocean as a boy with the sand coming up through my toes and the wind blowing in my hair. So I love boats, and seasickness typically doesn't bother me. So I was sitting up here, the waves were hitting the side of the boat, and we probably had it was a boat just like this one. We probably had 6 inches of water coming across the bow, and I was just up there having a grand old time while my film crew was downstairs holding their stomachs. Now, when you get to Patmos, it's about 9 miles long. It's a beautiful little island. It's idyllic in its setting. It was at first a penal colony in the days of John, the 1st century, and this is where John was exiled on the island of Patmos and brought out here by Diocletian, the ancient pagan Roman governor. And as historical tradition goes, John was boiled in a cauldron of oil there, but did not die. And it was his executioners were so incredibly amazed that John was still alive that many of them said it must be God that's protecting him. From there, John was taken to this island and exiled. It was the Roman emperor's desire to silence John's voice. But miracle of all miracles, an angel visitor visits John, and he writes the book of Revelation. This is a lovely little island today. This is the little capital of the island. It's a harbor called Scala. There are about 3,000 people living on the island of Patmos today. In the summertime, the population does swell some. One of the things that impressed me so much about the island is the pure water. You can see it better on the screens on the side, but we took this picture from above, And notice the water is so clear that you can see the rocks in the water down 2, 3, 4, 5 feet. And so the water is magnificently clear. We came in on a Friday night on one occasion, and I sat there dangling my feet over the water, and I read the first half of the book of Revelation. And as sun set on Saturday night, read the rest of the book of Revelation. And I don't think Revelation ever was so meaningful to me as the day that I read it there on the island of Patmos, where the angel visitor came and illuminated that island with heaven's glory. The island is quite populated around Scala, but once you get back on the island, you have almost very, very few homes at all. One of the things that impresses you about the island is homes have little chapels in the back. They're little quiet places where, if you're traveling, these homes open the chapels, and anybody can come to a chapel. These are family chapels. You know, isn't that a great idea? Each home having this little family chapel where you can go and be quiet and meditate and pray. You find that, and often these chapels are open with the door on this side overlooking the Aegean Sea. And so they are just tranquil places where you can renew your soul and heart to God. In the modern rush of 21st century society and the hectic pace of our society, we're called at times in this 21st century to find quiet spots, little parks, little benches where we can reflect and think about God. Now, the aged apostle, John, he was in his 90s by now, was sent to this rocky, barren outcrop. One of the things I like to do, and I wasn't aware of it when we originally came to Patmos. I traveled to Patmos on numerous occasions and was not aware of something really significant. There are the ruins of an old Roman fort that date to the 1st century, where John may well have been processed when he was first brought there. An archaeologist friend of mine, Randy Yonker, who teaches at Andrews University, first pointed that out to me. And it's a little rough getting there. When your boat comes into Scala, you have to go up a narrow path and climb up some rocks and around through some pastures. As I was climbing through these pastures, you notice the stone pastures? These are stone enclosures for sheep. And this is a sheep enclosure. And as I was passing by this sheep enclosure, something really impressed me. You remember in John chapter 10, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And he says, the thief cometh not but for to kill, to steal, and destroy, and I've come that they might have life more abundantly. Well, and then Jesus says, I am the door of the sheepfold. Well, this is a sheepfold. Will you put sheep? This is the door. And so the shepherd would sit here at night, fall asleep here, sheep would be in here, any lion come has to crawl over the shepherd. Any thief comes has to crawl over the shepherd. So the shepherd is the protector of his sheep. What an image of Jesus, isn't it? Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd. If the lion's going to get you, he's got to come through me. If the thief is going to get you, he's got to come through me. If Satan's going to come after you, he's got to come through me. So when we are committed Christians, we have a divine shepherd who sits at the door of our lives as our great protector. Now, as you climb higher and higher, one thing you're going to notice is that these are not natural stones. They're cut stones. These cut stones, you'll see the little marker here, the little indicator. These cut stones were part of a 1st century Roman fortress that was built here. Now, the reasons the Roman fortress was built here is because you have 365 degree of visibility. So from the fort, you could see totally around. So if any enemy ships were coming, you could see them. And I suppose that when John was brought to this island, he was likely processed in this Roman fort. I was quite amazed as I walked up these steps, these ancient steps, wondering whether John ever walked these steps, wondering what his thoughts were when he was brought to this island. An old man, deeply etched lines on his face, gray hair, trembling hands. He had no idea that an angel visitor would visit him and bless his life with new joy and new happiness. Now, in the 1st century, the Roman government, of course, exiled John here, and this is a monastery built by Greek Orthodox monks over the location, over the cave where they believe that John was exiled and where he was when he got the vision. Now, the thing that impressed me most, there's a little plaque on the cave. It says, Holy Cave of the Apocalypse, that's Revelation, on the island of Patmos. And John says, I was on the island of Patmos. Now, the monks chose a Bible passage to define the whole book of Revelation. And they put that Bible passage at the entrance of the cave. And according to the monks, this passage kind of summarizes the whole book of Revelation. And here's the passage that the monks chose to summarize the book of Revelation given to John on the island of Patmos. It's here, and let's get a little better close-up. Fear God, it's in Greek and English. Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him who made heaven and the earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. What does that mean? Well, fear God, the word for fear is a Greek word that means reverence or respect God. In other words, make God first in your life. Give glory to God. We give glory to God in what we eat or drink or what we put into our bodies. What a message in the 21st century. Respect God. Put him first in your life. Your life doesn't revolve around yourself and superego. Give God glory in what you eat or you drink. Your body is not a plaything, it's a temple. It's not a pleasure house, but it's a temple for the dwelling of God. The hour of God's judgment has come. The monks were right. They were warning humanity of the second coming of Christ. And so they put this verse there to warn all humanity that there would be a judgment hour, that we have moral responsibility and accountability for our actions. Then it says, worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. What's another name for the one who made heaven, earth, sea, and the fountains of waters? What do we call him? The Creator, right? So here in an age of evolution, here in an age of secular humanism, where people believe that they are the center of their own universe, God says, fear him. Make him first. God says, give him glory in what you eat or drink. It calls us from body-destroying habits. God's book of Revelation calls us to more responsibility in the light of the coming of Christ and the judgment. In an age of evolution, it calls us back to worshiping the one that made, worshiping the Creator. What a relevant message. We're going to talk a lot more about that in October. We're going to look at the book of Revelation and its prophecies for this generation today. Here on this island of Patmos, John's angel visitor illuminated the island and illuminated John's heart and gave him a message from heaven that John wrote down. And in Revelation 1, verse 1, it says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place, and he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John. So notice some people say, well, Revelation is a book of cryptic images. It's a book of mysterious symbols. It's a book of beasts. Nobody can understand it. But notice what it says, the revelation. Revelation doesn't mean something that's closed. It means something that's opened. It means something that's unsealed. And it's the revelation of Jesus. So the book of Revelation is Jesus' final message to mankind to prepare them for the coming of Jesus. Where did Jesus get revelation? God gave it to him. Why did God give it to him? To show his servants things which must shortly take place. And he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John. So deep within the heart of God, there was a message. And God gave that message to Jesus. And Jesus gave it to an angel. And the angel came down and gave it to John. And John wrote it down for you and me. It's pretty incredibly exciting, isn't it? To sense that when you pick up the book of Revelation, it's a book that comes directly from the heart of God. A message of love, a God's love letter for a generation that'll live just before his return. Now, when John wrote Revelation, it's addressed to 7 churches. And those 7 churches reveal different spiritual qualities. And what we're going to do tonight in those 7 churches is not so much look at them in history, but we're going to look at those 7 churches as they existed in John's day. And we're going to say, what did the 7 churches that existed in John's day, What did they go through? And how did what they go through and the people who lived back there in the first century, how does that mirror what we go through today? So here John, left-hand side, is on the island of Patmos. And he writes a letter in Revelation chapter 2 and 3 that goes to 7 churches. It goes to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamum, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, to Laodicea. One thing that's obvious but speaks to us is this: there is a Christian church in every one of those cities. Now, we're going to see the significance of that as we go on. So John writes a letter, and he writes it to Christians that are struggling, Christians who are living in these cities. The first letter, part of the letter, is written to a church, a group of Christian believers in Ephesus. So let's go to Ephesus, try to discover what it was like in the first century. The archaeological ruins of Ephesus are some of the most well-preserved in all of the ancient world. Ephesus is really an amazing city when you go there. As you walk down the major street of Ephesus today, you reveal the glory of a past civilization. Here on the right was the temple of Hadrian, also the Odeon. As you come down to the left, closed for many years, and you see here on the left-hand side were the houses of the intelligentsia, the houses of the wealthy. Some of these houses built on the hillside were 30 and 40,000 square feet, which would have meant that they would have 5 or 6 bedrooms, very large bedrooms, tiled floor. Their floors would have been heated. Water pipes going underneath the floor, heated by furnaces outside with forced air forcing the hot water under. Walls would have been heated. So it would get chilly in this area sometime. So the homes were actually heated. Magnificent homes, beautiful kitchens. These palatial estates have just been opened, and now one can visit them. As you continue to go down the street, you discover that this is one of the most influential cities in Asia Minor. It's an extremely wealthy city. It's a city where boats anchored in its harbor. Today, the harbor has receded, and the sea is about 1.5 miles, 2 miles away. But in the days of Paul, in the days of John, in the first century, boats would come right up to the city. Everything to delight the eye was there. Magnificent silks, carpets from Asia, food that was lush, sold in the marketplace, everything from grapes to grain to oranges to a variety of pomegranates and figs and dates and nuts. There were magnificent works of art sold there as well, statues and sculptures and paintings. You could buy about anything brought from throughout Asia as far away as the Orient, throughout Europe, was brought to Ephesus. Ephesus had about 150,000 inhabitants, so it was no small city. It had a very well-defined city government and amazing homes. Now, this is the home of one of the wealthy patrons of Ephesus. You notice the fine tile work, very carefully done. The archaeologists uncovered it and with brushes, hand brushed it off. You also see rooms for the preparation of food. You can see the pipes in the walls. Just a magnificent, magnificent home. Now, off the main boulevard is the temple of Hadrian. And Hadrian, of course, was one of the emperors. And Hadrian gave Christians some peace. He was one of the 7 good emperors. Hadrian was quite a, quite a playboy emperor. He had a number, not only did he have a wife, but When he found another woman, he thought that poison might be helpful for him to do away with his wife. And he also had a fancy for young men, fancy for young women. He wasn't a moral leader by any way, but he did give Christians some freedom. So you have the Temple of Hadrian. It's just magnificent. And you have the Odeum. It's a little theater where there were plays, music, performances. It sat 2,200 spectators. Then you have the Celsius Library. Now, the Celsius Library was one of three most famous libraries in the world. You had the Alexandria Library, the Pergamum Library, and the Celsius Library. The Celsius Library had about 18,000 books in it, or parchments, and it had a unique way to air condition so that you could take the humidity out of the library. Many people went to the library, many men, but there was a special passageway from here to the brothel, prostitutes' brothel, so their wives thought they were reading books, but they weren't reading books at all. Here you have, and I want you just to get a picture of the immorality of this city. So what you're thinking of when you think of Ephesus is this amazing city, this wealthy city, this cultured city, this educated city, but this incredibly immoral city. These are the signs to the homes of prostitution. You still see them in the streets. So you're thinking of an immoral city, a cultured city, a wealthy city, an educated city, a sophisticated city. But one more thing you're thinking about. You're thinking about the fact that this was the area of the Temple of Diana. But before we get there, I need to show you the Arch of the Freemen. There were two slaves, Sardis and Mithridates. They were Roman slaves for Augustus Caesar, and Caesar set them free. Augustus set them free. They were so appreciative of being set free that they spent a small fortune that they made as free workmen on building an arch dedicated to Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar didn't force them to build the arch. They built that arch because they were free. You know, we come to Jesus, and he frees us from guilt and shame and condemnation. We come to Jesus, and we work for him. We live for him, not because we have to, but because we want to. He puts that desire in the heart. The Arch of the Freemen. The Great Ephesians Theater sat 25,000. And it's an amazing theater. One day I was here with a group, and Billy Graham's daughter, Ann Lutz, was here with a very famous musician by the name of Artego. And as he began to sing, we had our group up here, we could hear it, and so we came down and spent a little time with Billy Graham's daughter and told her a little bit about some of the archaeology of that area that she was not fully aware of at the time. But this is really a magnificent theater. You can stand there today in the theater. Now, the seats were all marble. It was columns, and it was walled in. You can drop a coin on the stage, and you can hear the echo way, way back up into the stands. The Temple of Artemis was the first marble temple in the world, and probably it was one of the 7 wonders of the world. It was really a remarkable temple. It was here that Diana, Artemis is just another name, it's a Greek name really for Diana. And Diana was the multi-breasted goddess. They worshiped Diana, and you remember it was Demetrius that built the images to Diana. And when the Apostle Paul came and he preached Jesus Christ, the many gave up their idols. And Demetrius yelled out, "Great is the goddess of Diana." And people began to yell, "Great is the goddess of Diana." And so the Apostle Paul's life was threatened. A large group gathered in the stadium. So when you think of Ephesus, what are you thinking of? You're thinking of wealth. You're thinking of a sophisticated culture. You're thinking of education. You're thinking of immorality. You're thinking of the goddess of Diana. And you say, how in the world can the Christian church grow in a culture like that? That's so materialistic, that's so godless, that's so secular, that's so wealthy, that worships these false gods. Demetrius cries out in Acts 19, verse 26 and 7, Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying that they're not gods which are made with human hands. So not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute. See, Demetrius is saying, look, we're not selling the images of Diana anymore. People from all over the world are not coming to the temple anymore. Christ is worshiped. Christ is supreme. Christ is Lord. And Christ is demolishing our trade. We're losing our money. But also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia in the world worship. He's saying this magnificent temple, it's just going to go to decay because of Paul's preaching of the Christ. A riotous crowd gathers in the theater. They want to take the life of Paul. Paul wants to go in to address them, but his friends say no. And there you remember one of the procurators of the city stand up and they say, what has this man done wrong? And the crowd is eventually dismissed. They cry out, great is Diana, the god of the Ephesians. But the living Christ had planted a church there, and that church continued to grow. This is all that's left of the temple of Diana. One column that has been reconstructed with a bird's nest of an osprey on the top of the column. And you climb over these ruins and you sense that an ancient civilization collapses, but Christianity lives on. And the living Christ still reigns in the hearts. And John wrote to the Christian church that was established in Ephesus, the Christian church that so burned with this love for Christ, and he warned them of a danger. You see, today Ephesus is in ruins, but here you still have the stone work of a Christian church that once was there. John wrote to them at the end of the first century after Paul's death, and he had a concern. Revelation 2, verse 4 and 5. The Christian church was once powerfully strong in Ephesus. People's heart burned with this love for Christ. Nevertheless, I have this against you. You've left your first love. Remember, therefore, from where you've fallen, repent and do the first works, or else I'll come to you quickly and remove your lampstand from its place unless you repent. Echoing and re-echoing down the corridors of time come this lesson. It is possible to have a first love with Christ. It's possible to have that love burn in your heart, but it's possible through neglect and carelessness to have that love fade away. Ephesus once was a strong Christian church, but by the time you come to the end of the first century, it was filled with formalism and ritual. And John appeals to the church at Ephesus to be sure that duty does not replace devotion. Be sure that work for Christ never replaces the love of Christ. To be sure that in our hearts that living Christ still burns. We go from Ephesus to the second great city. It's Izmir today, or Smyrna in biblical times. It was very difficult to excavate there, and the reason it was is because Izmir is a very modern city. But there was a place in the center of the city where they excavated ancient Smyrna. The word Smyrna means sweet-smelling incense. Smyrna was a city where there were multiple pagan gods. You had Poseidon, the god of war, Dionysus, the god of feasting and wine. You have Artemis, the pagan god of love and temple. You have Demeter, the god of thunder and war. So these gods played key roles in Smyrna. Now, the Roman Empire was not necessarily a hostile empire toward Christianity. The Romans were quite broad in their thinking, and they allowed religious freedom. But this is one thing that Rome would not allow, and they would not allow any dissent to the Roman government. The reason that Christians were persecuted in Rome is not because they were Christians. It's because they exalted Jesus Christ above the Roman emperor and because they would not burn incense to Caesar in the marketplace. And so once a year in Smyrna, Every citizen had to come, swear allegiance to the Roman emperor by sprinkling incense and burning it. Smyrna was a Roman city, therefore this practice was followed once a year in the fortress here of Smyrna. John wrote to the church there in Smyrna. There was a Christian church there. In Revelation 2, verse 10, John says, "Don't fear, don't be afraid any of the things you're going to suffer. The devil's about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful to death, and I'll give you a crown of life." Notice what he says, you'll have tribulation 10 days. In other words, your tribulation's not going to go on forever. Somebody here going through tribulation. It's not going to go on forever. There's a limit to it. And he says, don't fear, because Christ is going to be with you. There was an old man by the name of Polycarp. He was the leader of the Christian church in Smyrna. He was arrested when he was 86 years old. And when the soldiers came to his house, and there are some pretty good historical records, he said to them, "Look, I'm about ready to sit down and eat my supper. I don't want to waste the supper. My wife's prepared it for me. So would you sit down? My servants are prepared. Would you sit down and eat the supper while I go pray?" So the soldiers actually ate, according to the historical records, Polycarp's supper. They brought him to the center of Smyrna. And there, the historical record says, in this very marketplace, the crowd shouts, "This is the teacher of Asia. This is the destroyer of our gods. This is the father of Christians." And the Roman provincial ruler was named Satius Quaterus, and he tries to make Polycarp deny his faith. He said, "Look, old man, whether you believe or not, all you need to do is take this incense and drop it and burn incense to Caesar." And the words of Polycarp are some of the most powerful words recorded. This is what Polycarp says: 86 years have I served him, and he's done me no ill. How then can I blaspheme the king who saved me? Polycarp says, 86 years I've served him, and he's done me no ill. How can I blaspheme the God, the Christ, the King that saved me? Polycarp was burned at the stake there. And they say he had remarkable strength, that as he was burned in that marketplace with the crowd screaming, there was a sense of serenity about him, a sense of peace about him. And here, echoing again from Smyrna, is a lesson for everyone going through suffering, everyone going through difficulty, and that is Christ is there. And one day that difficulty will be over. And you know, sometimes we step out from our friends for Christ. Sometimes to be a faithful Christian means that we don't go to some of the places attend some of the parties where the wine flows and it's immoral stuff's going on. Sometimes to be a Christian, it's a real cost. Sometimes a parent may not understand, or a husband or wife may not understand. But Christianity was never easy in the first century, but yet Christ never said it would be easy, but he said he'd be with us. When we make eternal decisions for Christ, he is there. We leave that city, but remember, there was a Christian church in Ephesus in the middle of that paganism. There was a Christian church in Smyrna in the middle of that persecution. We go to Pergamum. Now, Pergamum means exalted. It was a city built on the side of the hill. Notice this amphitheater. You take one step and you miss the second step going down, and you're going to end up in the bottom. I mean, this is so steep, it is remarkable. I'm always a little nervous taking tour groups there, particularly if I have a few older people. You know, if you have young people that are 71, 72, 73, like my wife and I, you don't have to worry about missing a step. But, you know, I worry about some of those older people in their 50s who really, you know, struggle a great deal. You know, some of those people in their 40s who miss the steps. So I always go first. You go through a little tunnel, and I always stand at the top and say, be careful now, don't miss that step. You know, I don't want them to do it. Now, what we typically do, this is really a lot of fun. I'll say to some of the young people, I want to run down to the bottom with you and run up. I want to see when they start puffing, That's the good diet that my wife serves that helps me be able to do that. But we run up and down the stadium. I'll tell you, if you're not fit, you are in big time trouble to try to run down this stadium. Incidentally, at the stadium here, and they often built stadiums with fabulous views. And the stadium, you can look out over the valley. It's incredible. Down here on the right, there's a little altar to Bacchus. There's another altar to Dionysus, but there were great plays that were held here. This is what an artist's rendition of what Pergamum used to look like. Here you have the stadium, and you have the upper city, the lower city. It was really magnificent. It had temples and beautiful homes, had a tremendous library. It was a really impenetrable fortress because it was up on the mountain. This is a great picture of the stadium. Notice the steepness of it again, but the sound was magnificent for music, for plays. The view from anywhere to the stage was quite outstanding. Pergamus, that exalted city, that city upon a hill, that impenetrable fortress. It was a wealthy city, a cultured city, an educated city. You walk down the main street today and you see the colonnades and the shops and the remaining of the shops. You see some of the statues that were there and the fine marble work that was done, the reconstructed columns of the temple of Apollo that was there, just a magnificent, magnificent temple. Now, off to the left here was the altar of Zeus. It's in ruins today, but I'll show you a reconstruction of the altar of Zeus. This is in the Pergamum Museum in East Berlin. This altar of Zeus is 20 feet high, 60 feet long, and it's where sacrifices were offered to satanic gods. Now, I need to go back to this picture. Today, it's in ruins. We were there a number of years ago, and I was there with the It Is Written international television program, and my staff wanted to get great shots up here. In that particular time, they were doing some repairing here, and they had an iron fence that went all around the altar. So the producer said to me, he said, look, I want you to climb over that fence because all I'm getting is the fence, and I'm going to go further up on the hill, and I'm going to shoot down on you standing on the altar of Satan because we want to get that picture. But I said, there's a sign on the fence. It said, danger, do not climb over this fence. He said, that's not for television crews. That's for the other people. So just climb over that fence. So I climb over the fence. Now, this is a true story. All the ones I tell are true. So anyway, I get over the fence, and I put my feet down on the center of this altar of Satan. And I will tell you, I stepped on a nest of vipers. The snakes were at least, this is not exaggeration, the snakes were at least this long. I had never seen snakes like that. There are 5 of them at least. I didn't count, but there are at least 5. They were thick, they were green, they had diamond heads, and they began to curl and hiss. I moved quicker than a marathon runner by the name of, or a 100-yard dash runner by the name of Usain Bolt. I mean, I could have beat him any day. I mean, I ran so fast, I don't know if I've ever been so scared in my life. I mean, my heart was beating. I thought, if I'm dying, I'm not dying on the altar of Satan. I mean, if I go down, I'm not going down on the altar of Satan, I jumped over the fence, and my producer said, I missed the shot. I didn't get the shot. I said, I will run the camera. You go back. I am not going back on that thing. And I didn't. I stood in front of the fence, and we shot it, and I don't know if we edited it out or what we did, but that's one of my great memories of Pergamum with the altar of Zeus. Incidentally, these are some original frescoes from the altar of Zeus, and what happened was some of the German archaeologists who excavated here took the measurements, they took the parts that they could take, and they reconstructed it in the Pergamum Museum in East Berlin, and it's really magnificent. My wife and I were there and just kind of reconstructing what would it have been like to have a Christian church in Pergamum with all these temples dedicated to pagan gods. How could you ever survive there in the midst of this lavishness and this wealthy temples to so many different gods. Now, the city had an extensive library, and this is really an interesting story. The Pergamum Library was the second most famous library in the ancient world. The Alexandria Library was the most famous. Now, when the emperor wanted to build the Pergamum Library, and so you had this little passageway, and the books would be on shelves here, and you'd pick them up off the shelves as you walk down. You can still see just a little bit here and here. This is where some of the books would have been anchored, and they had little shelves that come out, and you walk down these alcoves and pull out the shelves. Well, the Egyptians knew how to make papyrus, and so they had their writing, on the papyrus. There were no other places in the world at this point where they were making books. They didn't have vellum yet to make them, the animal skin. So they're putting them on all papyrus. So the emperor, who is in charge of Pergamus, contacts the chief librarian of the Alexandria Library. And he said, I will pay you much more than the Egyptians if you come and become the librarian of the Pergamum Library. He said, I really want you to come, and we'll give you this amazing salary. So the librarian agrees. But the Egyptian leader says, no problem, you can go, but if you go, I'm going to kill you. The librarian immediately chooses not to go under that death threat. So the Pergamum Library, the emperor here says, wait a minute, we got to do something. So he says, if anybody can figure out how to do books, because we're not getting that papyrus out of Egypt, you got to figure this out. They use vellum, animal skin. And they begin now all new systems of developing books. So you had the Alexandria Library, the Pergamum Library, and the Celsus Library. But again, you have these temples to the Roman gods, temples that are dotting the landscape. If there was anything that would destroy Christian faith, it was here in these temples. An image of Augustus Caesar. Notice you have the symbol of the sun god. This is the sun god. So the Pergamites worshiped the great sun god. Now, John writes to the church at Pergamus, Revelation 2, verse 12 and 13. He says, to the angel of the church of Pergamus, write these things, who has a sharp two-edged sword. What's the two-edged sword represent in the Bible? It's the Word of God. So the Word of God is judging the city and people of Pergamus. I know your works, and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, Satan's altar, that altar is Zeus. And you hold fast to my name. You did not deny my faith, even in the days which Antipas was my faithful martyr. There were martyrs in that city, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. Repent, or else I'll come to you quickly and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. What is God saying? He's saying, in the midst of this paganism, in the midst of all these false gods, there's a church at Pergamus that is still faithful. If there's anything that we learn from the 7 churches in the book of Revelation, it is that wherever you are, you can be faithful to God. Even if in your workplace there are no committed Christians, if there could be committed Christians back there that can be in your workplace, even if your friends are putting incredible pressure on you to compromise your integrity and Christian faith, if indeed they could be faithful back there, and here you have a Christian church planted in Pergamus. Then he says, to him who overcomes, I'll give some of the hidden manna to eat, and I'll give him a white stone, and on the stone a new name written, no one knows except him who receives it. What is this white stone all about? He's saying, look, you may be poor in this world. You may be poverty-stricken as a Christian, but I'm going to give you a white stone. In the ancient times, a white stone stood for 2 things. When a person was tried and they went through a judicial process and the jury was out, let's suppose they're being tried for robbery, tried for some great crime. When the foreman of the jury came in, he had in his hand 2 stones, a black stone and a white stone. If he drops the black stone, you're condemned. If he drops the black stone, you're going to prison. If he drops the white stone, you are free. If he drops the white stone, you are acquitted. If he drops the white stone, you are forgiven. So God says, I'm going to give you a white stone. You may be condemned as a Christian and poverty-stricken. You may be the offscouring of the earth, but I'm going to write a new name. You're a Christian, and I'm going to give you a new name, and I'm going to give you the white stone. You are forgiven. Always remember, hold the promise close to your breast that you're forgiven, you're acquitted, you are free. Now, the second meaning of the white stone is this. As ancient travelers traveled in biblical times, often they would eat in the homes of others who showed them prosperity, who showed them kindness as they ate in their homes. They would show them hospitality. Let's suppose I'm traveling through England and I have no place to eat. And you say to me, Pastor Mark, would you come to my home to eat? Would you say that? Nobody raised their hand. Oh, I got a couple invitations here. Okay. These people are a little bit more friendly than I thought. They're not as cool as I thought. So you say, come to my home and eat. So I eat in your home. Then we have a wonderful time. We eat. You serve me great food like some friends did last night. And it was just wonderful. We sat and we talked and we enjoyed one another. If we were living in biblical times, you would take out a white thin stone. You would break it in half and you would give it to me. And you would say to me, we had such a great time. If your son ever passes this way in future years, and I've died off, this stone will be passed down through generations. It'll be passed from me to my son and to his son. You pass that stone down. And if any of your family comes, any of your relatives come, show the white stone. It means you are welcome here. It means you belong here. So what does Jesus say? He said, I'm going to give you a white stone. Hold the promise in your heart. You don't live in this world, but you belong in heaven. You belong in another world where there's no sickness, suffering, or death. Hold the white stone promise in your heart. You are forgiven by the grace of God. You are redeemed by the grace of God. And you have an entrance into heaven by that grace. That's the meaning of the white stone. We go from there to Thyatira. Now, Thyatira is an interesting city. Again, not much excavation there. It's in the modern Turkish city of Akhisar. And you come to Thyatira. It was excavated there a number of years ago. Excavations are pretty poor. If you don't understand the background of them, you can be a little disappointed. Certainly not like Ephesus, not like Pergamos, not even like Sardis. But it was an amazing city. If you look at the columns, there was a promenade down the center road of Thyatira, and there were about 100 columns that were here. It must have been an amazing city. Now, when they built the columns, most people don't understand. They think the columns were built out of a single piece of block. They were not. Here's the base of the column. You see right here where my finger is. There was a metal that came up through the center, and typically they built the columns in pieces where you construct the column and you have this metal piece up the center to keep it from bowing. Now, Thyatira was famous for weavers' guilds and beautiful dyes. That made it difficult for Christians because every guild, weavers' guild, dyes, carpenters, metal workers, every guild had its own god. And every guild, to join that guild, you had to worship the god. And also they had certain orgies and other things that were very, very incompatible with Christianity. Lydia, the seller of purple, and here we saw just off a purple shop. They were selling purple. Lydia, the seller of purple, came from Thyatira. You know what purple is? Purple comes from a seashell, a mollusk, and you boil it, and it makes a purple dye. And that's where Thyatira came from. Rather, that's where Lydia came from, of Thyatira. She traveled, of course, to Philippi because that was a much more wealthy city and she'd have much more business there. One of the things I enjoy doing is crawling around on the ground and looking at some of these ancient pottery pieces on the ground. If you know much about pottery, you can pretty well date the pottery. The reason I like this one, and you can't take them home, if you want to come home, don't take any home. Because when you're going out through customs, they will check your bags and they will discover that you have pottery. These are ancient artifacts, and they will keep you in the country as a permanent, no, not as a permanent, but probably a guest for a year or two in a little prison. So, but this is interesting. What is this? This is pottery. This is not first century pottery. It's more medieval pottery. And it's interesting because it's the top of the pot. You see, it's here. And I've traveled with Dr. Hazel, who is really a pottery I wouldn't say a pottery expert, but he really knows pottery. You see something on the ground, he'll say, that's 2nd century, that's 1st century, that's 9th century. I can't do that yet, but I'm able to tell some of the pottery. Thyatira, notice again, something I don't want you to miss. Notice again, you're building the wall here. This is Roman period. This is Roman period. You see the bricks here? So what you basically do is create another brick wall a little lower, and you put your stones between it when you're building the walls, and the bricks kind of hold everything together. No other city seems to have had so many guilds as Thyatira. They had coppersmiths and bronze workers and tanners and dyers, workers in wool and linen and pottery and bakers. What did John say to that city? Revelation 2:19 and 20, I know your works. Sure, you're working all these guilds. I know your love, your service, your faith, your patience. As far as your works, the last are more than the first. In other words, you have more works than you do faith. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. Because you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants and commits sexual immorality and eat things offered to idols. What's going on in the church there? There's compromise. This idea of Jezebel was a false teacher. So false doctrines came into the church at Thyatira. You see, Thyatira represents spiritual adultery. So here, this church that was so faithful to God drifted away from God, and human teachings came in. One of the great dangers of the Christian church today is that the teachings of human beings supersede the teachings of the Bible. Some people say to me, why are there so many different denominations? One God, one faith, one Bible. You don't go to the church to find out what the Bible ought to teach. You go to the Bible to find out what the church ought to teach. And what we're living in today, particularly in Christianity, is a great age of compromise. Great age of compromise where false teachings have come into the Christian church. And I think that's why it's so incredibly important that each one of us understand the Bible. And that's why on Monday nights, Pastor Jock is going to have a Bible class right here. If you've studied the Bible all your life, that class is for you. If you had new in studying the Bible, that class is for you. Because there you look at some of the depths of the Bible. He will unfold it principle by principle, Bible text by Bible text. And if you've walked with Jesus 40 years, you ought to be in that class. If you're new in Jesus, you ought to be in that class. If you're a member of a church, you ought to be in that class. If you don't have any church, you ought to be in that class. Because you'll learn how to have a bedrock, solid faith. We go from Thyatira to Sardis. Now, Sardis was the part of the Lydian kingdom. It was one of the richest empires in the world. This is the gymnasium in Sardis. It was a thriving community, had a large marketplace. There was a lower city and there was an upper city here. This city of Sardis was one of the wonders of the world. Croesus, the richest man in the world, was the king here in this city in the Lydian Empire before Christ. One of the reasons this was so rich, Croesus lived from 570 to 546 BC in the days of Babylon, the days of Persia. He was considered to be the wealthiest man in the world at the time. And why? Because gold and silver coins were first used in Sardis. The rivers ran with gold, and they mined the gold in the rivers, and they got silver out of the hills. And so this is where gold and silver coins were introduced. Now, a philosopher came from Athens. And so Croesus said to the Greek philosopher, of all the men you've ever met, who's the happiest? What did Croesus think the guy was going to say? You are, Croesus, you're so rich. You must be happy. And the philosopher was a very wise man. This is what he said. I see that you're wonderfully rich, and you're the Lord of many nations. But with respect, with that whereon thou questionest me, I have no answer to give you until I hear that you have closed your life happily. He said to Croesus, if you're lying on your deathbed and you know you've fulfilled life's purpose, and you're happy when you're dying, that's more important than all the wealth in the world. Knowing that you have a purpose to live for, knowing that there's something beyond yourself. Now, this is the gymnasium and the sports center there. And just to get the idea of the gymnasiums in those days were health centers. So you could go into the gymnasium and you'd first go into like a sauna bath. It was like a steam bath, more of a steam. It was wet heat. And after that, you'd go into the frigidarium. Frigidarium? I mean, the water was cold. You'd sit there. Then you'd go back into a tepid pool. And so you can still see the 3 pools here. Then you get a massage. So they had hot and cold treatments. They had massage. They had health treatments. They had gymnasiums where you worked out to develop your muscles. Now, just to show you how large this is, here's my wife and I here. But look at, this was about a 3-story building, gymnasium in the time of Croesus. When you look up and take a picture and shoot your camera up, you see the very fine detail. This must have been a magnificent gymnasium indeed. This is a fascinating building. This is a Jewish synagogue that was built around the 1st century in the days of Paul after the collapse of Croesus' Lydian Empire. One of the things that impresses me about the ancient world is the lavish tile work, every stone set individually in place. The Lydians had a very sophisticated government, very, very sophisticated government. They had a highly defined judicial system. But as you walk around among these ruins today, you discover the ruins of a Christian church. You see, out of these ancient cities, Christianity grew. And those civilizations crumbled, but Christianity still flourishes. And I'm wandering around the ruins and I come across a cross reminding us that in the midst of paganism, Christianity grew and Christianity flourished. There is a fascinating lesson, though, that Dr. Hazel and I often point out. And this is Dr. Michael Hazel, archaeologist, historian. There's a famous lesson that we like to point out. Lydia fell to Persia when Cyrus surrounded the city. So Cyrus surrounds the lower city. But if you can see carefully, up here, you're going to see walls. These are walls. So the Lydians fled up to the higher city. This was an impregnable fortress. And there, as Cyrus surrounds it, he said to his soldiers, look, if any of you can figure out how we can attack that higher city, if you can do that, I will give you a lavish financial reward. So one night, one of Cyrus's soldiers was there at the base of this mountain. And he heard something rolling down a pathway, and he looked up, and it was the helmet of one of the Persian soldiers who was on guard, who fell asleep. And as he fell asleep, his helmet fell off, and it came down a narrow pathway that led up to the city. The carelessness of a century resulted in the loss of a kingdom. And here you see the wall ruins still on the top of the mountain. That helmet falls down. The guy falls asleep. The guard, the Greek runs back to, the Persian runs back to Cyrus, and he says, wait a minute. The Lydian forces, we know how to get up there. I can take you up. And they find the secret passageway. Carelessness. You know, sometimes people compromise their faith in carelessness. Sometimes it's the little things that the devil uses to destroy us. Now we're going to travel from Sardis to Philadelphia. Philadelphia is not much of an archaeological site, but it's a wonderful place for me because I've made some good friends there. I get off the bus, and this is my Muslim friend. He says, Mark, you're back again, puts his arms around me. I met him probably, it must have been 20 years ago now. I was with It Is Written Television. We left there 14 years ago, so probably 20 years ago. First came there shooting an It Is Written Television program, and it's raining. And my friend saw me in the rain, shivering underneath some little covering, and he said, you're cold. I got to give you apple tea. Gives me apple tea. Next time my wife is back with me and we have 60 people, he said, his wife, we got to give you apple tea. Gives me apple tea. Next time I come back, 150 people there with me on 3 buses. My wife's gone, no apple tea for today. But one time I came back, I think last time I had about 200 people with me. It was and I didn't see his wife. I said, well, where's your wife? He said, she's in the hospital. She's in the hospital. And while we're talking, he keeps pointing to these satellite dishes, and he's trying to talk to me in Arabic and Turkish, and I couldn't really understand him. And finally, I get the translator. I said, what's he talking about? Well, he's watching you on television all the time now on the satellite dishes in the Middle East. And so I said to him, but your wife, she's not here. No, Mark, she's really sick. She's in the hospital. So I get my Muslim guide who can speak Arabic, and I say to him, look, I got my cell phone with me. And do you have a cell phone that's a direct line? I don't have her direct line. Oh, yeah, I do. Can you call her on her cell phone in the hospital, and can I pray for her over the phone? So here we gather this Muslim man and a Muslim guide. She's translating into Arabic my prayer. And at the end, he just throws his arms around me because he's so thankful to God for our relationship. And so we just love Philadelphia for that reason. Philadelphia was in AD 17, an earthquake destroyed the city. Tiberius rebuilt it. Attalus was given the title Philadelphus because of his loyal love for his brother Eumenes. There were two brothers, and one of the brothers was called Philadelphus, and that's where the city of Philadelphia in ancient Bible times was built up on. There's very little that remains of that city. A lot of earthquakes took place, and so they tended to keep their doors open for a long period of time. Philadelphia became a Christian outpost to take the gospel to Asia. It was God's open door for the continent. Philadelphia, when you think of Philadelphia, you don't only think of brotherly love, you think of an open door. And this is what God said to the church at Philadelphia in Revelation 3, verse 8. I know your works. See, I've set before you an open door, and no one can shut it. For you have little strength, and you've kept my word and have not denied my faith. What is really the message of Philadelphia to a 21st century society? What's the message from Philadelphia? It's this. When you make a decision to serve God, He's going to open doors for you that you don't yet imagine. You may feel you just have a little strength. And sometimes to step out, to be a fully committed Christian, sometimes to do that, it takes faith and courage. But when we do it, God opens doors in our lives that are unimaginable. We're leaving there to our last site, and on our way to the site, it's called Laodicea, we stopped by Hierapolis, because in Hierapolis they have hot springs, and these hot springs have bubbled up for centuries. They don't flow as rapidly anymore because of the fact that many of the hotels have siphoned off this hot water, and as they have, they've used it for spas, for tourists. But you see what we call these travertines that take the hot water from here. In ancient times, they took it from here across the valley, 7-8 miles to Laodicea. Laodicea didn't have a good water source at all, and so the Romans built these, what we call travertines. You see them here, where the hot water could flow across the valley to Laodicea. And they built these pipes, and so you see the water would flow down, they'd go through the pipes, sometimes carried in the travertine, sometimes carried in the pipes. This is Laodicea. When I first began to go to Laodicea, Laodicea was not excavated. The University of Pamukkale is excavating it today, and the site is really quite an amazing site. Here is the Republic of Turkey, the Ministry of Culture. The University of Pamukkale is excavating that site. It was a wealthy center of education, commerce, healthcare, and it was a center that was the home to about 150,000 people. It was so rich that when it was destroyed by an earthquake in 61 AD, the Romans said that Romans really had a fancy for Laodicea. They really admired it. It was a Roman outpost. They said, we'll send you the money to rebuild it. And the Laodiceans said, nothing doing. We don't want Roman money. We're wealthy enough. We're proud enough. We'll rebuild our own city. Laodicea was destroyed by an earthquake, 61 AD, and its citizens refused Roman help. The Hippodrome, you see that this is where they did the horse races. You still see a stone there. Laodicea's stadium seated 10,000 people. It's not, at least the last time I was there, it wasn't excavated well, a lot of weeds growing up, but you can still see where the seats were located. Hot water was carried via an elaborate system of channels and aqueducts from nearby Hierapolis. But by the time it got to Laodicea, it was lukewarm. It had to come across this valley. And in Revelation chapter 3, verse 20 and 21, John sends us a message. And he sent a message to a church at Laodicea. He says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I'll come in and I'll dine with him. I'll have supper with him and he with me. To him who overcomes, I'll grant to sit with on my throne as I overcame and sat with my Father on his throne." Overcomes what? Overcomes apathy, overcomes complacency. One of the greatest challenges to Christianity today in the West is complacency, is apathy, where people say, you know what, I'm a Christian, but so what does that mean? We look at 7 churches that really reflect our lives. In Ephesus, God says to us, be careful, or that love that once burned in your heart can be gone. In Smyrna, God says to us, you may face persecution and ridicule, but I'm with you. In Pergamos, God says, when you're exalted, be careful, because pride comes before a fall. In Thyatira, God says, don't let your work suck you in and worship it as God. In Sardis, God says, don't let carelessness eat away at your Christian life. In Philadelphia, God says, the essence of Christianity is love. And if you step out for me, I'm going to open doors in your life that are incredible. And in Laodicea, God says, be careful that you don't become apathetic. The message of the book of Revelation speaks with relevance to your life and mine today. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we hear John speaking to us.